So I want to tell you a story to get started today on talking about culture, because there's certain ideas that kind of drive this element. One of the ideas is that the world is not as it should be, that there are problems in the world is not as it should be, and we are called as followers of Jesus to engage the world, to be about the solution to those problems, but we all have something in common, and that is that it's very difficult for us because often we try to withdraw or we want to protest the negative things we experience in culture. I want to tell you about what I experienced last week when on our visit to Mexico City. Andy McCullough and I went down there and had the pleasure to represent our church. And I'll just tell you, I don't say that lightly. It is our pleasure to represent all of us together and the things that we're doing. But we went and visited some of our partners that we've been working with for a number of years now, people who are working around the issue of human trafficking. And the issue and the work that's being done is relatively new. The awareness is relatively new. It goes back less than 10 years ago. And at the time, there was this really incredible woman that's now our friend, and she's a leader in a local congregation there and leads an organization who became aware of this issue of human trafficking and how young girls that were minors were being kidnapped and forced into sex slavery. And many of them would be forced to be there for not just a few days, but up to years. And their stories are all very, very sad, very terrible, every one of them. She became aware of it and one day snuck into a public health meeting for prostitutes, and these girls really weren't prostitutes because they were kidnapped and slaves forced to do this, and met the first survivor of human trafficking that they know of in Mexico, and she helped her escape from her situation. And really, she discovered that this is a widespread problem and that new things needed to be created. And so one of the first things that she did, along with her congregation and a bunch of generous people, is they formed the first safe house for victims of human trafficking in all of Latin America, because there were a number of victims. And one at a time, girls began to come to the house. And there at the house, they would be cared for. And you can imagine the problems that come with life after something like that. But there are a bunch of generous, kind, loving people who would nurture these girls, care for them, provide for them, and the safe house was made. Well, new things also needed to continue to emerge, and so Rosie and the other people there were very aware that there's just terrible laws in the country that didn't allow them to prosecute traffickers. And so she thought, well, someone needs to run for Congress to help pass some new laws, so I think I'll do it. So she runs for Congress, gets elected, wins Congresswoman of the Year, and begins to pass laws, anti-trafficking laws, that have really started to change the country. The Lord only gave her one term, and now she's busy lobbying for the laws that would be present in all of the many Mexican states. As the girls began to get older that were living in that safe house, she realized that we need a new place for them because they can't stay here in the house with the younger girls. They're now adults. They're in their 20s. We need something new. And so a number of people began to create something new. And this is where Cornerstone's really been helping the last several years, support for those adult victims of human trafficking who have aged out of the safe home. And so a group of people got together and started helping these girls fulfill their dreams. And so, they have dreams that they believe that the Lord gave them, and they're following God in these dreams. And so one of them started a barbershop, or a salon. I guess it's not a barbershop, a salon. I'm sorry, girls. Oh, geez. Starts a salon, and it's providing for her family, and she hopes to have this grow and grow so that it will be jobs for the underemployed in her country. And there are others that are now going to school, studying to be lawyers that we've been supporting in their education and different things to help them make it to that place. And I got to tell you, I wish you were all there. Because on Monday, Andy and I sat down, and I've been there several times. Andy's been there several times. But we sat down. I think this is the first time that we had the girls go through one at a time and tell us their story from start to finish. And it's an honor to hear about something so terrible when someone shares their story like that. And so we hear the first story, and we hear about a girl who was locked in a room for 3 months straight, trying to break her spirit so that she'll work the way they want. We heard of another girl who was forced into prostitution for 2 years as a teenager. We heard about how they had the courage to escape. We heard about how the safe home made a difference, how people cared for them. We heard about what they're doing now, the salon, going to med school. And, they're there, and they thank us for the little bit that we've done, but I wish you were there to enjoy it. I wish you were there to feel the sorrow, to feel the pain of just knowing that the world is not as it should be. But I wish you could have been there in the same moment and said, thank God that he sends people into the world that make a difference, right? And so it's this intense battle of emotions that takes place when you sit and you listen to something like that. But it embodied the element of culture for us. This is exactly what it means to be a church that takes something like this serious. For us here at Cornerstone, our element of culture means to steward, shape, and restore the environments that God has placed us in. That's exactly what they've done down there. That's exactly what we've done in helping support them. I'll tell you one more part of that story that was amazing. So you can imagine the girls have some very emotional issues, and life can be hard as they leave. But we saw one of the girls who's recently been having a hard time just adjusting to adulthood after something like this. And while we're there at lunch, we took them all out to lunch, she's holding one of the newest girls' hands. And she's rubbing her hand, and she's whispering to her, and she's speaking to her. And she's caring for a girl who just the Tuesday before, 5 days before, was rescued in a raid. And when they entered the place that she was working, she had a shackle around her neck and her wrists and her arms, and her body is covered in sores, and her face is covered in scars from being whipped. She's 20-some years old. She weighs 70 pounds. The world is not as it should be, but at the same time, someone who's gone through the very same thing is loving her and caring for her and listening to her, and they laughed. That little girl weighed 70 pounds. She ate more food than I did. I've never been so proud. Watching a woman eat. But it's incredible. That's what it's about, to be about shaping culture in big and small ways. And I hope you see in a moment that the small things can't be overlooked, because most of us won't have to experience something at that level in our lives, but God still calls us into our culture to be about changing what needs to be changed, to steward, to shape, and restore the environments that God has placed us in. Here's my favorite definition of culture. It's what we make of the world. God started the world. He made the world. He made culture. And then in a sense, he takes his hands off, and he says, now do something with it. And unfortunately, people make bad choices. And so sometimes we do bad things with the world and with culture. But there's also this redeeming quality that God continues to call us into. The element of culture is a reminder of how we're to engage a world that at times seems to be against people of faith. We're not the first ones who feel pressure because of our faith. We're not the first ones who feel like the culture around us is changing so quickly it's getting harder and harder to follow Jesus. I feel that way, but we're not the first ones to be in this place. And God always has the same message for his people, which is your starting place should not be to protest or withdraw, but it should be to engage in a loving and a wise way. And I'm going to show you a passage that's really important to us here at Cornerstone. We bring it up all the time. It's Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 1 through 7. If you have your Bible, you can turn there. Many of you are familiar with the context, because the context is the Babylonian exile. We mentioned this all fall during that series, but if you weren't here, here's what happened. Babylonian Empire, thousands of years ago, conquers the nation of Israel, and as they conquer the nation of Israel, they haul away those that have survived. Well, first of all, they ruin the temple, they ruin the city, and they take away all the educated artisans and the royalty, and they haul them across the desert to a faraway city called Babylon, where they're now to live as servant exiles, and they're there to serve that empire. And when they arrive, they begin to ask the question, how is it that we're to preserve our faith? How is it that we're to protect our children? How is it that we're to protect our families? How is it that we're to protect our way of life in a place that is so difficult? And not only a place that's so difficult, but a place that embodies being ruled by your enemies, because they were their enemies. And their captors are in charge, and they're now away in this foreign land, and the Babylonians are working really hard to help them conform to their culture, and they're asking the question, what do we do? And as is always the case when that question comes up, certain people are saying, stay away from them. They're evil and they're terrible. And others are saying, just isolate yourself or fight against what's taking place in front of you. But God, this is God speaking, because God is the one that spoke through the prophets, has this message for them and anyone else who at times in their life says, what am I to do with a world that doesn't seem to fit, that's not quite right? It's not the way it should be. mean, it's all around us. Just this week, an 8th grader stabs his classmate at one of our public schools. I mean, the world as it shouldn't be is all around us. You don't have to look for it. I don't have to convince you of it. But what do we do when these things happen? Well, here's the answer. So Jeremiah sends a letter to the king of Babylon, and on the way, the letter, they stop and they read a separate letter to the exiles kind of living in their slum. They're all there together, huddled up, asking this question, what do we do? What do we do with this world? How do we engage this world? Do we even engage it at all? And this is what he says, verse 4. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. And then verse 7, here's the verse that's worth memorizing if you're a part of this church. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. He is answering a number of questions that occur when someone says, what do I do with a world that is difficult, that is not quite right? And the answer is you engage it. And there's a certain quality, there's a certain direction that we're moving the culture that we engage, and I want to go through these things. But I want to show you just how difficult it can be to engage culture when it begins to press us. There's a number of different alternative ways to respond to a world around us that's changing, it's getting difficult. The first way is you can just conform. I love the line in the video we just showed. You can give in to the trends and tangents of culture. Culture has a lot of them, right? And we can be shaped by those things. But I'm assuming, because this is people gathering in a church, that you don't want to be shaped by culture. You want to be shaped by the Lord. So I'm making that big assumption and moving on quickly, okay? So that's the first one. The second option, though, is one that is very natural for many of us, and it is to fight against what is wrong in our culture. And this can happen a number of different ways. There's such thing as a silent protest, in a sense, where we can kind of sit back on our soapbox away from culture. We can condemn it, and we can, with judgment, say that I want nothing to do with that because it's wrong. Now, at times, this makes perfect sense. And really what we do is we take the posture of this. We kind of cross our arms and look down our nose at the culture around us. It reminds me of my 4th grade teacher. She gave me that look often, Mrs. Kane, and it scared me every time. But we do that. And it's not just us that does it. The whole world does this. When someone is different from them, we kind of cross our arms, we take this posture, and we have a silent protest. But then there's another type of protest, and it's one that's more aggressive and coercive. It's publicly stating our dislike. It's protesting against things. These protests can get violent at times. They're mean, they're aggressive, and they usually don't lead to the change that we'd like to see. But this becomes really, really natural. We get aggressive and go after things. And so, sometimes this shows up on picket lines and people writing nasty things in editorials. But I want to mention a few tools for this aggressive, coercive fighting against culture that are common today. There's this little tool that lots of people use today to condemn culture, and it's called Facebook. Unfortunately, I don't know how to unfollow someone because I don't know anything about computers, and so I just have to scroll down very quickly when I begin to read some of the venom that God's people put on Facebook for everyone to read, condemning culture. Like anyone asked for it, or that people really take them serious, or that really is convincing. It's not. It's an attitude of putting up our fists and saying, I'm against what's taking place. Another one that's common in churches today is people often ask us as pastors to use the pulpit. And if you don't know what the pulpit is, it's this up here. It's the preaching area. It's the, preaching God's word. People want pastors to use the pulpit to condemn culture. Many churches do. We will not do it. And so those people that usually ask the questions like, why aren't you going after this? We always give them a disappointing answer. We talk about sin here, we talk about God's right way of living, but we won't condemn culture from up here. We see it as an alternative to something different than what God is speaking to Jeremiah about how to engage culture. So we fight. Here's another posture, and it's a posture of just being idle. And you can think of it like this, just standing back at a distance to make sure that the problems in the world don't bother us. I mean, it's very possible to live our lives in such a way that we don't surround ourselves around any pain, any struggle. I mean, it usually enters in our own life, but we don't want to be around anyone else's. And usually what happens is we say, you know what, as long as that thing that's not as it should be is not entering into my family and my home and at my work, and it's not affecting me personally, I'm not going to care about it. And the posture we take is not crossing our arms or putting up our fists, but we turn our back. And we stay idle. And we don't engage. Now, neither of those postures, the fighting or the idleness, sound like the spirit of what Jeremiah is trying to communicate to a group of people who are going through things more difficult than what we go through. An author I like to read, Miroslav Volf, it's quite a mouthful, his name, but he talks about this the problem of idleness and coercion. He says, you know what it really results in is a shallow faith that doesn't really bring about cultural change. He says, there's only one real option for followers of Jesus when you understand what he did and how he changed culture. And this is how he describes it. It's only creative engagement with the world. You could add in there wise, loving, creative engagement, because there's a time to be wise and to know when and how. But it's creative engagement. A book we like to read here called Culture Making. I'll make sure it's out on what the staff is reading section out there in the lobby next week. Author Andy Crouch says the only way really to change culture is to create new and better culture. That's not his message. That's the message from the Bible. That's Jeremiah's message. Create something new in this new difficult place. He's asking them to engage creatively with wisdom. Look at the word that he uses. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city I've called you, the place I've called you. Seek, to pursue, to run after. It's active. It's not just thinking. It's not just putting off good thoughts or good vibes. It's actually working towards something. It's having a dream of something and working towards it. I can remember when I pursued my wife. It was like mission number one. I had tunnel vision. There was no way that she would say no to me. And I was trying to get this thing sealed as fast as possible. It was a little freaky for her. Wasn't the wisest way to do it, but I can remember pursuing her. I knew what I wanted. I loved her, and I pursued her. I made incredible sacrifices, spent a lot of time and money pursuing her. That's what happens when you seek after something. You adjust your life around it. And that's the word that shows up here. Seek the peace and prosperity of this place among your enemies. And look, it's very, very practical. Build houses, settle down, plant gardens, have families. He's saying seek the peace and prosperity in an area of life that you actually have control of. Don't worry about the things you don't have control of. Use the environments that you have control of. Shape those places. Now, this is a really important message for them because prior to this letter, they had heard different voices. They had heard the voices saying, be idle. Just wait this one out. Turn your back and wait this one out. And they had heard the voices of fight against it, condemn it. In fact, Jeremiah addresses these voices. It's showing up in a few teachers. Verse 8, do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams they encourage you to have. By the way, these dreams they're encouraging them to have nostalgic dreams. To just say, remember what it used to be like? That's what you need to make. And Jeremiah is saying, that's crazy. The world has changed. Nostalgia can stop the process of creative engagement. We can constantly say, oh, I wish it was the way it used to be. Now, who doesn't wish certain things were the way they used to be? But it doesn't help. And he's saying, let's get past that. Verse 9, they are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. And later he says this in verse 26, of those, listen to this, of the leaders saying, do not engage. To the leaders having a different message than seek the peace and prosperity of the city in which I've called you, this is what he calls them in verse 26. He calls them a maniac. I love it when the Bible gets rude. And it does right here. Saying, if there's anyone among you, especially these leaders that say protest and condemn culture, if there's anyone among you that says turn your back on culture and isolate yourself, they should be treated like a maniac, because it's absurd to think that God's people would withdraw or fight against culture rather than lovingly engaging it. I mean, that's the language. It's absurd to think that God's people would ever think that there's any other option. See, we're God's people with a purpose to be a blessing to the nations, a light to the world. And I love that the language is strong. Crazy. See, there'll always be a voice that will tell us, run and hide or fight. It'll be someone else's, it'll be some other friends. At least for me, sometimes it's the voice in my own head. You know, it's different when you're a parent because you worry about your kids. And you're afraid of what's happening. And it's easy to say, oh, I want to isolate them and hide them. Or if we're forced to deal with it, I'm going to run in there and just, break things up. That's the voice in my own head. But here's a different voice. It's the voice of the Holy Spirit telling us what Scripture says, and it's to engage, to move towards it. Think of the people who have made a real difference socially, cultural changes in the world. And I'll mention a few that some of you are familiar with. I'll show this picture here. They'll be up there. The oldest guy there, William Wilberforce. He's awesome. He was a Brit, yep. And after he had his experience with God, he stopped living for himself and began to live for the Lord. And the Lord said, I want you to be about changing culture. So he had the means to run for office, and he became part of Parliament. And he led a number of significant social changes, most notably helping end the slave trade in the British Empire. They did this before the Americans ever did, and he's the face of that. And he did it with loving engagement, proposing something different and better. And he was patient, and he worked at it over and over and over again. And then there's guys like Elie Wiesel and Abraham Heschel, Jews who lost their parents in the Holocaust, who became prophetic voices speaking out for people who were victims of injustice. And so they spoke and they wrote. And there were at times where they would speak and they would write in a way that was condemning what was evil in the world. But more than that, they had a spirit of engaging and moving people towards something better. Incredible. Or Harriet Beecher Stowe, she wrote the novel of the century, of the 19th century, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It swayed the North to believe that slavery was wrong. It was a fictional story about a slave. And this single lady working as a school teacher in a little schoolhouse in Connecticut wrote this book that changed the world. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr., what he did in making sure that it was not violent. I mean, they were using this principle, wise creative engagement with culture. Not standing back fighting, condemning, and not standing back just allowing it to happen. They engaged culture. Now, I do want to say this. There is a time that we do these things. There's a time to stand back, and there's a time to say, things are wrong. But the starting line, this is what we see in the passage. It's the idea of the element of culture. The starting point is to engage, to create something new. And you know what made these people effective in changing the world is what also makes a mom or a dad effective at home in changing what needs to change in their family. I've become very aware that kids go through phases. And phases are just, it's a fancy word for new challenges you're not prepared for, all right? And when you have 4 kids, their phases are all different. So we're learning something different every time. And it's easy for us to just ignore what's wrong. It's easy for us, Elise and I, to just discipline and be against it. But it's a whole nother thing and much more effective when we engage and we help shape and change something and create something new. But the same is true with you and your roommates or you at school or with work. There are things around us that we bump into that are not right. And we'll always hear the voice, just let it happen or fight against it. But creative engagement is something different, but it works. It's the principle we see here in the passage. Engage, engage, engage. Now I want to make the point one more way. Verse 27, after he says, seek the peace and prosperity of the city, he says, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. Now that's a significant piece of instruction to a group of ancient Jews, because prayer to them was not something that was trite to say, I'm going to pray for you. It was not something that they just threw out there like we often do just to be nice. This is the greatest way to serve someone, is to pray for them, because they understood something that hopefully we all should, and that is that prayer is as much about changing us as it is changing the world, okay? So they're praying that the world would change, but they know as they begin to pray for their enemies and bless their enemies, it sounds like Jesus. In fact, Jesus might have known, I'm sure he knew this story. When you begin to pray for your enemies, your judgment and hate is transformed to love and compassion. And so to be told to pray for them was a huge step. And really, God is saying there's nothing that you shouldn't be willing to do for them. It's part of what it means to follow me. And so he says to pray, something that was so sacred to them. Now, I want to use a few examples of how this shows up. And I'm not trying to just bother people here, but I want to help us think about engaging culture more effectively. Think about the issue of abortion and unplanned pregnancies. There are some who don't like that think the answer is to picket and protest. And we know how that usually turns out. And we know what kind of change that usually leads to. But there are some that think, hey, I need to do something. And I think they come to the conclusion thinking that the best way to bring about a change is to protest and condemn that negative thing. There are others, and I kind of go into this boat, that at times I think, you know what, I'm going to engage the issue only when it's convenient for me. So from time to time, I just engage with an occasional vote about how I think things should be. And a lot of time goes by without me being a part of the solution. But what's the solution? What's creative engagement do? Well, it calls people to think about being foster parents and being adoptive parents and mentoring single mothers and supporting organizations that do. And so you see the difference between turning your back, saying, I'm just going to let it happen, and protesting, but this different attitude of having creative engagement? It leads to creating things that are good, and that is what changes the world. God uses it. It's an effective tool. Or think about poverty. People often talk of the poor in pejorative ways, saying, they're poor because, they're lazy or different things. There are those that just kind of, fight about certain policies in the government around the poor. But then there are those that actually help the poor. And if they have the means to have a job or a business, they provide jobs for those that are underemployed. Or they get connected to programs that help move people out of poverty. Or one of the things we do here is we go really far upstream and we help with one of the number one indicators of future poverty in someone's life, and that is helping kids read at grade level by third grade. It's one of the number one indicators that someone will not move into poverty if they can read by third grade. Well, that seems pretty ordinary and simple, right? Well, it changes the world. Makes a huge difference. And so creative engagement makes us serve. It gets us out there. It makes us active because we're seeking the peace and the prosperity of the place that God has called us. Now think about what we're trying to change things to. We're not just trying to change the world, but we're trying to change it into something that reflects God's desire, what God created from the very beginning. And we see it here in the passage. It doesn't just say change it the way you want it to, but it gives us a very specific word. It says seek the peace and prosperity of the city. Peace and prosperity is the translation from one very, very special Hebrew word, ancient Hebrew word, the word called shalom. And we use it a lot here because it's a loaded word in a good way. It's ancient, but it means a number of different things. Shalom means that things are whole and complete. For there to be shalom, it means that things are healthy and there's well-being for all involved. And then the third layer of shalom means that things are at rest. And that's the part, it's at peace. And that's the word that God chose to use. Seek the shalom of the city. If you think about that, there's nothing shalom doesn't care for. There's nothing that shalom wouldn't change. And he's saying change it the way to what would reflect God's character. Jesus understood this. It was the message of the kingdom was to build his shalom in the world. And that's the word that shows up here, to build shalom into the world. Now, there's a lot of people when they read this verse that says, well, it's just about caring for people. This doesn't mean that we're to enter into all the different domains of culture, but that's really not true. There's a reason that God says seek the shalom of the city. This idea of a city is something that's encompassing of all the many different areas of culture. This is the city of Babylon. It's the capital of the greatest empire in the world. It's the cultural center of the world, the artistic center of the world, the center of science. You name it, center of business, it's the center. And when he says seek the peace and prosperity of the city, he could have said seek the shalom of the culture that you're put in. There's nothing that's off limits to God's people bringing creative engagement into the world. And so he says, serve this city, serve this culture. Isaiah 65 describes God's desire for cities, locations, and cultures. They'd be a place of public celebration and happiness, public health for children and the aged, housing for all, food for all, healthy supported families, and the absence of violence. I mean, there are a lot of people that are surprised that these kind of things are in the Bible. I'm surprised people don't see it when they read the Bible, because it's everywhere. God cares about these things. And he wants us engaged. So how do we do this? Where do we start? That's always kind of the question. Where do I start? Because there's so many problems, and what can I really do? Well, I want to play devil's advocate for a second, and I want to say you start by not wanting to change the world, okay? So I'm going to play devil's advocate with my own message. That's a bad speaking technique, but I'm going to do it anyway, all right? I really hate getting emails and being given books nowadays that are basically promote some new idea that says, we're going to change the world. This is going to change the world. Because usually what it means is it's some big idea that someone came up with so that they might get famous that usually fizzles out in just a few months. And I'm really tired of hearing how we need to all be changing the world. But we're obsessed with it. I'm going to make the point this way. I mentioned that book, Culture Making. Well, in the book, he does some research about our obsession about wanting to change the world. And he found that in the year 2004, there were 1,600 books on the Amazon library that were written around the subject of changing the world. Okay, let's change the world, all those different subjects. They did some scientific way to figure it out. And they figured out there were 1,600 books. Guess how many of them had been written in the previous 4 years? A third of all books in the Amazon library on changing the world had been written in the previous 4 years. If you go back to 1990, half of all of the books that Amazon has, and it goes back hundreds of years, or at least 150 years, half of all books written on how to change the world had been written the previous 14 years. And he begins to break down by decade. The 80s, only 18 books. 70s, 4 books. 4 in the 50s. And then the first half of the century, only 6 books total on how to change the world were written. He's making the point, we're obsessed with changing the world, but we don't even know where to start. We love the idea, but we miss the simple, practical steps that are right in front of us. But our passage helps us understand what it is that we're to do. The letter is sent to ordinary people who have limited resources and limited influence. The letter is written to them saying, change the world in the environments that you have control of. Your family, where you work, the people that you're around, the communities that you're in. And you change the world by doing the things that you're already doing, but you do them in such a way that you're moving the world towards shalom. The entire strategy is ordinary. Think who else is in Babylon at this time. A very famous person named Daniel. He's the hero of the exile. Daniel gets the job of being second in command only under the emperor, and he actually serves 2 different emperors. He's very powerful. He changes policy, he changes laws, and we know him because he survived the lion's den, right? But Daniel was incredible. He changed the world. But the letter is not written to him. It's written to a bunch of ordinary people who are wondering what to do and to stay isolated. It's written to a bunch of people like us. We're like the unnamed exiles more than we're like Daniel. But we all like to think we're Daniels. There are very few Daniels. But there are a lot of unnamed exiles, ordinary people, who steward and shape the environments that God has put them in, doing the things that they're already doing. So the strategy is simple, but it works. One small step at a time. And one thing we have to notice with the strategy is a lot of times we think, the small things, they don't really matter. The things that go unnoticed, unnamed, they don't really matter. But they absolutely matter to God. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58 says, therefore, my beloved brothers and sisters, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. Brian's version of that is the Lord makes it count. He takes it all and he makes it count. And the world has changed in such ways. Culture is changed in such ways. And so if you minimize what you can do, please don't. You don't need to go looking any further than the environments you're already in, your cultures you're already in, and you can use what you have to bring about God's shalom in greater ways. I want to tell you one last story. The worship team's going to come out and we're going to take communion together. Some people begin to think when they hear a message like this, what right do I have to begin to mingle in the world and to bring about change? And, we worry about really whether or not this is our place. But I want to make the point that it absolutely is your place to be a part of these things. Because you belong to the God, the Father, who owns it all, who created it all. Culture is his. but we belong to him. We're sons and daughters. And when you're a son and daughter, you begin to make claims in such a way that some of the same claims your parents make. And so I'm going to illustrate it this way. I grew up in a family that had a number of small clothing stores, small businesses in small towns throughout Colorado. And I can remember as a really young boy feeling free to just run around my dad's stores, my mom and dad's stores, wherever we wanted. And they were old buildings, like 100-year-old buildings. And it was fun for little boys to run around in the attic with creepy mannequins, with their necks cut off, heads cut off. It was weird, but it was fun for a little boy. And we would run around. There was nothing in the store that was off limits to us. I mean, we could go in my dad's office whenever we wanted. We could do whatever we wanted. Why? Because my mom and dad from early on made us feel like this was our store. But we also knew that this really wasn't our store. It was my mom and dad's store. They paid for it. They worked hard in it. They borrowed the money. But they had, because we belonged to them, had made it our store. So that's how we always talked about it. And so we went wherever we wanted. But as we got older, I realized that, we actually, as the kids in the family and our store, we actually care about what happens here more than the employees do. So when theft would take place or something would happen with the building or business was bad for a period of time, our family would sweat it. And we'd worry about those things. And we'd work hard to see them change. The employees didn't worry the way we did. Why? Because they weren't owners. And I can remember as we got older going to my dad with new ideas about how to make the store better. But because it was our store, guess what? Dad listened to us. I can remember telling Dad, hey, Dad, Nike shoes are way better than kangaroos. We need to get some Nikes. Bo Jackson's were the first shoes that ever showed up. It was awesome. Changed the store forever. But it was our store. And my dad and my mom made us feel like we belonged there, that we had a part in shaping it and stewarding it, and we cared about it. Okay, that's the same message God gives to his people. The world is his, culture is his, but he says you are owners in it, co-owners, co-creators in it. Be a part of shaping it and moving it towards shalom. We are all invited into the process. Some are Daniel, some are Esther's, but most of us, these unnamed, ordinary people who use the environments they have to shape the world. So let's pray together. Let's bless this element in our church. Let's ask that God would increase it more and more. It's very important, especially in the place that we live. Let's ask God to show us what this means for each one of us. Father, I pray right now that you would speak to us all. I pray that you would speak to us with a challenge, that you'd move us in a certain direction, that we might see an environment in our life that actually needs to change. An environment in our life perhaps that we've been resisting. We've been protesting against it, or we've been standing back idle from it. Maybe even we've been conformed to it. We've conformed to it. Father, I pray that you would show us those things and you begin to speak to us about how we can bring creative engagement in that place that brings about your shalom. Father, I pray that we would represent you. I pray that we would build what you are building. And I pray that we would take very seriously this world that you've given us. And so, Father, show us what that would be in small ways. And Father, I pray for our church. I pray that you would increase this element here. I pray that we would take our stewardship of culture very serious. I pray that our church would continue to be about mending and changing and solving the problems that are around us. I pray that there would not be a task too small and there would not be something too big that we couldn't handle together. And so lead us in this. Help us make good decisions, but most of all, God, help us be engaged. Make us active as we seek the peace and prosperity of this place that you love, that we also love. And we pray this in Jesus' name. All right, I want to transition to communion. The ushers can come forward. You're going to be dismissed from the side. You're going to grab the elements. But there's another famous verse in Jeremiah 29:11, where God says, you know what? I have a plan for your life. I love you and I care for you. And God makes that plan absolutely possible because he engaged us. He engaged the darkness of the world by hanging on a cross where his body was broken. He hung on a cross and he poured out his blood for each one of us, engaging us so that he might create, what does it say? He created something new to turn dead people into new creations. And so that's what we're going to celebrate now. We're going to remember this. This is God's covenant with us. It's the terms of the relationship, his death, his substitution for us. And we return that gift with giving back to God our very lives. And so as you come up, there's juice and wine, so be aware of that. You'll go back to your seats, and you can take the elements on your own as we sing this last song together. All right, you can just be dismissed.